The eviction notice landed beside the mashed potatoes. It didn't just land. It was placed there with the kind of deliberate, surgical precision that my father, a man who prided himself on emotional detachment, had perfected over 30 years of marriage. The envelope was cream-colored, heavy stock, the kind you use for weddings or graduations, not for destroying your daughter's life on a national holiday. It sat there, a stark white rectangle against the beige, fluffy mound of the potatoes, steam rising from the gravy boat nearby like a silent witness to the execution of our family. My father sat back in his chair, the mahogany creaking under his weight, and folded his hands across his stomach. He looked like a man who had just finished saying grace, calm, assured, and utterly devoid of empathy. Across the top of the envelope, in bold, angry black ink that seemed to shout over the gentle clinking of silverware, it read, "Notice to vacate and surrender possession." My mother, Serafina, smiled first. That was always her tell. That was how she administered poison. She never raised her voice, never shook with rage. She simply offered that small, tidy, terrifying smile that made cruelty look like simple administrative duty. It was the smile of a woman who had learned to weaponize politeness. 7 days, she said, her voice light and airy, as if she were discussing the weather forecast. Your brother needs this house, Lyra. It is time for Kaelin to have a fresh start. I looked at Kaelin, my younger brother, the golden child who had never held a job for more than 6 months but wore entitlement like a second skin. He didn't look embarrassed. He didn't have the grace to look away or offer a mutter of apology. He looked relieved. He looked like a man who had just been handed a winning lottery ticket he hadn't earned, a get-out-of-jail-free card for his life, paid for by my eviction. He was practically vibrating with anticipation. I stared at the paper without touching it. The steam from the turkey was still rising between us, carrying the scent of sage and rosemary, but the room had gone ice cold. The warmth of the kitchen, the memories of past Thanksgivings, the laughter that used to bounce off these walls, it all vanished, replaced by a suffocating silence. I looked up from the notice. I didn't scream. I didn't beg. That wasn't my way. I swallowed the hard, jagged lump in my throat and stared at the 3 people I had called family. I saw them for exactly what they were, scavengers waiting for the lion to leave the carcass. I understand, I said. My voice was flat, methodical, stripped of the emotion that was currently tearing through my chest like a storm. I saw my father relax his shoulders. He let out a small, almost imperceptible sigh. He thought he had won. He thought I was broken, compliant, the obedient daughter he had trained me to be. He had no idea that in that moment of surrender, he had just handed me the one thing I needed to stop being the daughter and start being the owner. If you have ever sat at a table where the people who are supposed to protect you instead serve your own destruction on a porcelain plate, if you know the taste of betrayal that is bitter and cold, then you understand the silence that fell over that room. It's a silence that screams. Before we get to the storm that followed, if this story resonates with that deep, burning need for justice, if you believe that patience is the most dangerous weapon, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe. This is a story about what happens when you push the quiet one too far. The truth is, I had been paying for the air they breathed in this house for 5 years. I am 30 years old. As a medical coordinator, my life is measured in vitals, in crisis management, in the precise, unyielding language of survival. While my mother, Serafina, was busy hosting grief retreats in Sedona, charging people thousands of dollars to cry in the desert, and while Kaelin was drifting from one failed startup to another, crypto, dropshipping, whatever get-rich-quick scheme was trending that week, I was here. I was the anchor. This Asheville villa, with its sprawling oak floors and views of the Blue Ridge Mountains, had become a mini hospice. I ran it single-handedly for my grandfather. I can still smell the phantom scent of antiseptic mixed with lavender oil that clung to the curtains in his room. I remember the 3:00 a.m. alarms, the panicked scramble when his oxygen saturation dropped, the nights I spent sleeping on a hard wooden chair next to his bed just to make sure his breathing didn't stop while I wasn't looking. I didn't just give him medicine, I gave him his dignity. I shaved his face when he couldn't hold a razor. I read him his favorite books when his eyesight failed. I held his hand when the pain was too much to speak through. And while I did this, my mother treated him like a chore, a burden she had to endure until the inheritance was unlocked. Serafina used to corner me in the hallway. her voice dripping with that fake, airy sweetness she reserved for her passive-aggressive attacks. "You're just a glorified nurse, Lyra," she'd say, looking at my scrubs with a disgust usually reserved for vermin. "Don't get too comfortable. This house belongs to the family legacy, not a servant. You are replaceable." Kalen was worse. He was vulturous. He would walk into the room while I was changing Grandpa's IV bags, his eyes scanning the furniture rather than his dying grandfather, and joke about how much the hardwood floors would fetch on the market. "You're playing house, sis," he would sneer, his laugh echoing in the sterile room. "But the real players are coming back soon. Enjoy the fantasy while it lasts." They thought I was being a martyr. They thought I was too emotional, too soft, too nurse-like to see the long game they were playing. They mistook my care for weakness, my silence for stupidity. But they forgot one crucial thing about my job. I am trained to see a collapse before it happens. I monitor the signs, the subtle shifts in pressure, the slight irregularities in rhythm. I didn't stay here out of weakness or sentimentality. I stayed to keep Grandpa alive long enough to ensure his mind stayed sharp and his signature stayed valid. While they were out spending his money on retreats and failed investments, I was sitting with him and his attorney. We didn't just write a will. We built a fortress. We laid traps within the legalese, knowing that one day the wolves would come. They broke my heart back then with their coldness, with the way they treated a dying man as an asset list. But today, looking at that eviction notice resting on the Thanksgiving table, I realized they didn't just break a bond. They triggered a trap. And I was the one holding the hammer. The weeks between Thanksgiving and my mother's 60th birthday gala were a masterclass in delusion. Serafina had planned the event for months, envisioning it as her coronation as the matriarch of Asheville high society. She had invited every power player, every local politician, every trust fund socialite to what she thought was her home. The air in the house changed in those weeks. It became thick with the scent of expensive lilies, the forced laughter of planning committees, and the frantic energy of a woman trying to polish a facade that was rotting from the inside. I stood near the catering table on the night of the gala, still in my professional blazer after a long shift at the hospital, feeling like a ghost in my own living room. I watched the guests mill about, sipping wine that cost more than my monthly salary, admiring the art that I had dusted, standing on floors I had polished. Serafina floated toward a group of local socialites, her diamonds catching the crystal light, her smile practiced and radiant. "And this is Lyra," she told them, her voice a practiced trill of condescension. She didn't introduce me as her daughter. She didn't acknowledge the blood tie. "She's the help who stood by my father until the end. Such a dedicated girl, really. We're so glad she could stay on to assist with the transition." The guests gave me those tight, pitying smiles you give to a stray dog or a waiter who has spilled a drink. I just took a sip of water and looked past them, my eyes locking on the clock on the wall. I was counting down the minutes. Kalen was out on the veranda, his face a sickly shade of gray that no amount of expensive cologne could mask. He was leaning over the railing, whispering frantically into his phone. He looked paranoid, his eyes darting around the garden. Behind the hedge, I spotted a dark SUV idling at the end of the driveway. Two men were inside, silhouettes in the shadows, watching him. Kalen didn't want a fresh start. He was drowning. He had spent months bragging about his investments, flashing wads of cash at the country club. But the reality was much darker. I knew because I had done my homework. He had borrowed money from people who do not take. I am broke for an answer. He needed this house to be his, not to live in, but to liquidate immediately, to flip for cash to pay off a debt that was about to cost him his life. He was desperate. I watched him wipe sweat from his forehead with a shaking hand. He looked at me through the glass, his eyes filled with a desperate, cornered kind of hatred. He was not just greedy anymore. He was a trapped animal. "You are done, Lyra," he mouthed through the window, thinking he was the one in control, thinking that the deed in his pocket, or rather, the one he thought was being transferred, would save him. I didn't blink. I just thought about the thick folder sitting in my lawyer's office and the specific clause I had triggered 48 hours ago. Kalen thought he was fighting for his life. He didn't realize he had already lost it. While they were busy celebrating a house they didn't own, I was in the boathouse, the only place on the property that felt quiet. I looked at my phone. It was time for the smart strike. I didn't need to shout. I didn't need to cause a scene. I had already visited the bank manager, a man who had played chess with my grandfather for 30 years, a man who respected loyalty. I had placed a notarized affidavit of forgery on his desk. The paper trail of how Serafina had faked my signature to take out a home equity line of credit was undeniable. The fraud department didn't need a week. They needed an hour. Then came the utilities. Since the house was legally mine, every bill, water, sewer, and the massive electric grid that powered this Asheville estate was in my name. I had scheduled the service termination 48 hours ago. No bureaucracy, no waiting for a technician, just a simple request to stop service on a move-out date. It was efficient. It was clinical. It was exactly how I handled every crisis. Inside the villa, the gala was at its peak. The crescendo of the string quartet was filling the hall. Kaylin stood on a chair in the center of the room, raising a glass of vintage scotch he had stolen from Grandpa's private stash. "To a new era," he shouted, his voice slurring with alcohol and triumph. "To a home that finally belongs to a winner." The lights didn't flicker, they just died. The hum of the industrial air conditioning vanished instantly. The expensive chandeliers went black. The darkness was absolute, swallowing the room whole. A collective gasp rippled through the dark room, followed by the sound of crystal shattering against the hardwood floors. The silence that followed was thick with confusion. "Lyra," Serafina's voice shrieked through the darkness, high and sharp. "What did you do? Fix this immediately." I didn't move from my spot by the boathouse door, but the music didn't stop. I had presynced a heavy-duty portable generator to a separate AirPlay speaker system I had hidden in the foyer days ago. The house was pitch black, silent, except for the heavy rhythmic beat of the track I had chosen. It was a bass-heavy, ominous tone, the kind you hear in movies right before the villain reveals themselves. I walked into the living room, the glow from my phone screen the only light in the space. The guests were shadows, fumbling in the dark, smelling of expensive perfume and sudden, sharp panic. I felt like I was walking through a tomb of my own making. "I don't live here anymore, remember?" I said, my voice cutting through the noise, amplified by the acoustics of the silent room. "And I don't pay for the comfort of people who try to steal my roof. From here on, you can toast in the dark." The tension was louder than the music. "Lyra, stop this nonsense." Serafina's voice vibrated with a panic she couldn't hide from her high society friends. "It's a fuse. Kaylin, go to the cellar and flip the breaker." "I wouldn't bother," I said. My voice wasn't loud, but in the dead silence of the mansion, it echoed like a gunshot. "The power isn't tripped, it's disconnected, and the cellar, that's my next stop." Suddenly, the heavy bass of the music cut out. I didn't stop it. The pre-programmed transition I had set up on my phone took over. A new audio file began to play through the hidden speakers. It wasn't music. It was a recording from the nanny cam I had hidden in Grandpa's room months ago to monitor his breathing. A camera they never knew existed. Kaylin's voice filled the dark ballroom, distorted by the cheap speaker, but unmistakable. It was a conversation from a week ago, spoken in the room where their father died. "Once she is out, we tell the court she has had a mental breakdown from the stress of caretaking," Kaylin's voice hissed through the speakers. "We get her committed. I grab the deed and we flip this place to the developers by Christmas. She is just a nurse, Mom. She is a servant. She doesn't belong in a house this expensive." The room went tomb quiet. I could hear Serafina's sharp, ragged intake of breath. I could hear the guests shifting, moving away from my mother and brother as if their deceit were contagious. I could hear Kaylin's boots scuffing the floor as he backed away from the sound of his own betrayal. Then the front doors didn't just open, they were held open. Flashlights cut through the dark like searchlights, sweeping across the terrified faces of the elite of Asheville. Two men in dark suits stepped into the foyer, flanking a woman holding a badge that glinted in the artificial light. "Internal Revenue Service, criminal investigation," she announced. Her voice was like a gavel striking the judge's bench. "Serafina and Kaylin, we have a warrant for a search of these premises and an order to seize all assets tied to the fraudulent home equity line of credit filed on this property." "Wait," Serafina shrieked, her administrative poise finally shattering into a million pieces. She reached out for a guest who recoiled in horror. "There has been a mistake. This is a private family matter." It stopped being private when you submitted forged documents to a federally insured bank. One of the agents replied, his flashlight beam landing squarely on my mother's face. In the beam of their flashlights, I saw Kalen's face. The sweat was pouring down his cheeks, his eyes wide and white. He wasn't looking at the police. He was looking for a way out. He knew that if he didn't have the money, the men in the dark SUV outside, the lone sharks, would not be kind. He was looking for an escape before they realized the money they were promised was gone. I stood there, bathed in the stray light of the federal agents, watching my mother's elite friends scramble for the door, covering their faces to avoid being associated with a crime scene. For the first time in 5 years, the air in this house felt clean. It felt like the storm had finally broken. Kalen didn't wait for the agents to reach him. He bolted. In the chaos of the flashlights and the shouting, he scrambled toward the back of the house, knocking over a waiter in his panic. He headed for the stone cellar. I knew exactly where he was going. He believed the rumors he had heard all his life, that Grandpa had hidden a collection of gold and pre-war antiques in the foundation to keep them out of the hands of the tax man. He thought he could grab the treasure and run. I followed him. Flanked by the professional security escort my lawyer had insisted on, we descended the stairs into the humid darkness of the cellar. We could hear him before we saw him, his breathing ragged and desperate, sobbing as the sound of metal striking stone filled the damp air. We found him swinging a heavy mallet against the ancient stone wall. "It's mine!" he screamed when my flashlight hit his face. He looked like a madman, dirt smeared across his tuxedo. Grandpa owed me, he knew I needed it. With a final, desperate heave, a section of the wall gave way, crumbling to the floor. It revealed a small, velvet-lined alcove hidden behind the masonry. Kalen reached in, his hands shaking, pulling out 3 heavy, ornate silver platters and a small wooden chest. He laughed. It was a high, broken sound of pure triumph. "I win, Lyra," he yelled into the dark. "You can keep the empty house. I have the legacy." He didn't notice the security guard stepping forward. I just stood there, watching as he wiped the dust off the chest, cradling it like a baby. "They are replicas, Kalen," I said softly. He froze. He looked down at the silver in his hands. In the harsh light of the flashlight, the antique shine looked dull, cheap. He flipped one over and his eyes landed on the small modern stamp at the bottom, "Made in Taiwan." He dropped the platter. It clattered against the stone with a tinny, hollow sound. He fumbled with the chest, ripping it open. It was empty, except for a single folded note in Grandpa's handwriting. I didn't need to read it to know what it said. It was a receipt for the donation Grandpa had made 3 years ago, transferring the real collection to a historical foundation in my name. Kalen dropped the mallet. It clattered against the stone floor, the sound of his entire future hitting rock bottom. "You wanted the house, Kalen?" I asked, my voice echoing in the cold cellar. "You can have it, but you should know the living trust owns the land it sits on, the air you are breathing, and every piece of furniture upstairs. The bank is outside to seize the structure, so enjoy the empty walls. You finally got exactly what you earned." I turned my back on him. I didn't look at Serafina as she was led to a patrol car for questioning, her diamond earrings flashing in the cruiser's lights. I didn't wait for the bank to slap the seizure notice on the front gate. I just walked to my car, my grandfather's real signet ring heavy in my pocket, and drove away from the mountain. The lights were out behind me, and for the first time in 30 years, I was not the one tasked with turning them back on. The dust has finally settled in that house in Asheville, but the silence feels different now. It is not the heavy, suffocating silence of Grandpa's illness or the jagged, ugly silence of my mother's glares. It is the silence of a clean slate. The legal fallout was surgical. Serafina was sentenced to 9 years in state prison for grand theft and multiple counts of identity theft related to that forged home equity loan. The court also ordered a restitution of $185,000, money she does not have. Kalen is currently serving 5 years for felony property damage and resisting arrest. Because he couldn't pay back those black market creditors he owed, his reputation in this town is lower than the dirt in that cellar. Even their so-called elite friends have scrubbed them from their social media feeds as if they never existed. 6 months after the arrest, I received a letter. It was smuggled out of the correctional facility by a former cellmate of my mother's. I didn't even open the envelope. I could see her handwriting through the thin paper, starting with, "Lyra, how could you be so cruel to your own flesh and blood?" I didn't get angry. I didn't feel that old familiar knot of guilt in my stomach. I just walked to the kitchen island, the same place where that eviction notice once sat, and dropped the letter into the shredder. The mechanical hum lasted for 5 seconds, and then she was gone. Indifference is a much more powerful shield than hate ever was. Now my life is filled with a different kind of noise. I spent last weekend at the villa with my chosen family, my lawyer, my neighbor who stood by me, and a few colleagues from the hospital who actually know what it means to show up when things get hard. We didn't talk about the past. We talked about the future. I have started the paperwork to convert the west wing of the house into a respite center for caregivers. A place where people like I used to be can come to breathe, rest, and be reminded that their sacrifice is seen. I am sitting on the porch now, looking at the mountain peaks of North Carolina as the sun dips below the range. I am Lyra, and for the first time in 30 years, I am free. But before I go, I want to leave you with a lesson I had to learn the hard way. Most people tell you that blood is thicker than water. They usually leave out the rest of the quote. The blood of the covenant is thicker than the water of the womb. Here are 3 rules for surviving a family that views your heart as a target. First, loyalty is a currency that must be earned through action, not inherited through a last name. If they wouldn't treat a stranger the way they treat you, they aren't family. They are just people you happen to be related to. Second, never let them see your next move until the lights go out. Information is power, and the people who want to control you will use your honesty against you. Keep your plans in the dark until your foundation is made of stone. And third, kindness without the power to defend itself is not virtue. It is just a lack of options. You are allowed to be a good person, but you must also be a dangerous one to those who try to destroy you. Kindness must have teeth. If your family treated your sacrifice as a trial period for their greed, would you have the courage to let them fall? Or would you keep lighting yourself on fire just to keep them warm? Tell me your story in the comments. I am listening.